Hi, everyone. Welcome to Genealogy Adventures. I'm Brian.
And I'm Danya. How are you guys doing today? I don't know. Did our thing play? Because I didn't
It,
see it.
it,
Okay. My okay. So y'all, I'm on. My thing is doing its own thing again. So if I blink out, you know what's going on. My internet is acting crazy, and we're gonna do that.
Technology is technologying. Um,
Yes, yes. Life
welcome,
is life.
yes, indeed. Welcome to the show, everyone. And again, thank you for spending the next hour with us, no matter how you're tuning in. And we have a really interesting show today. I mean, all of our shows are interesting, but I'm going to love this one because Donnie and I are going to actually learn, well, basically new information just as well as you guys. Love this show.
Yeah.
Love it when when we're able to come away with something new.
Yes. Yes.
So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the show Alan Spears. Alan Spears is the Senior Director for Cultural Resources for the National Parks Conservation Association, or NPCA for short. Alan uses real life stories and a conversational style to connect with his audience to promote the National Park Service's work in protecting, interpreting, and managing the nation's historic and cultural resources. Alan has led community outreach and legislative engagements on a variety of park protection issues for over 25 years, and he's also an active veterans advocate. Alan has led or co-led several successful national monument designation campaigns, including those for Fort Monroe in Virginia, the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad in Maryland, Colonel Charles Young Buffalo Soldiers in Ohio, Birmingham Civil Rights Monument in Alabama, and the Blackwell School National Historic Site in Marfa, Texas. In 2018, Allen began to lead the NPCA's portion of the multifaceted campaign to establish the Emmett Till and Mamie Till-Mobley National Monument in Illinois and Mississippi. That work, performed in close concert with community partners and the Trust for Historic Preservation, resulted in President Biden designating a Till-Mobley National Monument in July 2023. Allen's current national park protection priorities include coordinating NPCA's work on the designation of a new national park for Julius Rosenwald and the Rosenwald Schools. And he's also a Clemson University Institute for Parks Robert G. Stanton Award winner. And fun fact, Allen remains the only NPCA staff person to be rescued from a tidal marsh by a park police helicopter, and I am sure there's a story behind that. Welcome to, welcome to the show.
Brian, thank you. Thank you. Tanya, thank you.
I,
It's good to be with you.
I think
Yes.
you're the first guest we've ever had that needed to be rescued in any capacity.
Well, hopefully not on this not on this broadcast, but yeah.
And let me just add, this is my coworker, colleague, guys. This is somebody that I work with in at my job, and I just love this job, and I'm learning so much from it. So this is going to be something really great right here.
Okay. All right.
I think the first thing that really intrigued me about the work that you do, and Donnie, you filled me in a little bit about the kind of a foundation of it, is I guess when we think about social justice or social equity or heritage and culture kind of monuments, um, or actually advocacy, let's start there. You kind of think of the big marches and press and media and cameras like all over the place. Whereas the work that you do is it's kind of quieter. It strikes me as being much more behind the scenes, but equally powerful and impactful. And I'm just curious, what brought you to that side of advocacy?
Oh, well, Brian, it was complete serendipity. I was finishing up work on a master's degree at Howard University, and it turned out that one of the professors on my thesis defense committee also knew somebody at NPCA. They were looking for interns, and it was a paid gig. And this was Washington, D.C. in the late 1990s, and not all internships were paid. So I got an opportunity to sign up, and I did 2 3 month internships in the Enhancing Cultural Diversity program for the National Parks and Conservation Association. We hadn't dropped the and yet. And I really liked the work. NPCA, like many nonprofits, was overstretched and understaffed. So within the first 6 months of me working with NPCA, I got to be a community organizer, a writer, a photographer, an accountant, a bookkeeper, I did all of these things, and I got to travel, and I got to see some of these incredible national parks. And what happened is in the process of being with NPCA in those first 2 years, I got to meet a gentleman by the name of Shelton Johnson. And Shelton Johnson is a ranger at Yosemite, and he is well schooled in the history of black regular troops, also known as Buffalo Soldiers. He's an incredible interpretive ranger. If anyone out there saw the Ken Burns series on national parks, you know that Shelton was an American Ranger who was one of the talking heads, and he's just an incredible person. Really great person, good man, good resource. What Shelton shared with me, just as we continued to email and think about these things, we've only met a handful of times, was that he regarded the expansion of the telling of the African American experience through national parks and through the preservation movement as the next logical chapter of the civil rights movement in this country. That we had fought for voting rights, we had fought for human rights and equal representation and equal protection before the law. And so part of the next step, those fights haven't stopped, they continue still. But part of the next process, or the next part of that process, was to make sure that we were protecting and preserving these stories. So stories like, Birmingham civil rights, the Project C protest that took place there in April of 1963, heroes like Amesy Moore, Fannie Lou Hamer, Medgar and Murray Evers, and now Emmett Till and Mamie Till-Mobley, to make sure that these stories were highlighted at the national level, so that we have an understanding that in the same way that the Grand Canyon National Park is a national, international resource, so is the story of our civil rights history. And I've been happy to be able to work with NPCA, various administrations, a lot of people in the National Park Service and the Department of the Interior, and our partners across the country to increase the system diversity and the stories that the National Park Service is telling. It's good work. It's necessary work.
Excuse me. So for audience members who are kind of new or have just recently joined us and finding out about what Donnie and I like to talk about, could you provide the difference between preservation and conservation for people who may be unfamiliar with either of those terms?
So that's a very loaded question, and I can't do anything in attempting to answer that this afternoon except get into trouble with somebody.
Oh, no.
Um, I think that for me, just as a personal, and I'm not looking off camera at Webster's dictionary or trying to bring up anything on my phone. Conservation has always felt to me like it is more along the lines of protecting and preserving natural resources, scenic and recreational resources. Preservation is about material culture, it's about people, it is also about landscapes, but cultural resource landscapes and other things like that, battlefields or significant cultural areas, like, for instance, the Gullah Corridor that runs from Florida through South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia. And so that's what I would say would be the differences, or the differences between those two words for me.
Mhm. And I guess the other word that I found really interesting was the use of the word campaign.
Mhm.
I guess I just thought, being very naive, and this is why I'm going to find this conversation interesting. I thought it was just, oh, you fill in an application, you get people to say this is a really great idea. Obviously, the more influential the people you can get behind it, I thought the better. Um, but can you talk me through why the word campaign and kind of what that signifies with the process?
Sure, I regard the word campaign as being something that implies a multifaceted approach to the work. And I would share with you that from the year zero, whatever society or country we're talking about, the process of preservation has generally been a political one. And in this country, it is the same thing. That doesn't necessarily carry with it a negative connotation. But what it does mean is that in order to establish a new national park site that commemorates a particular story, you have to make sure that there is either legislation establishing that site and then funding to support that site after it's been stood up, or a campaign directed towards the President of the United States to get them to use their executive authority to establish a site, reserving that territory, that land, those resources in perpetuity for the benefit, enjoyment, and inspiration of the public, and to commemorate that particular story of those resources.
Mhm.
Um, Rarely, if ever, has that happened when one person said, you know what, I want a national park over here. And even if you go back into the early period of, our first national park being Yellowstone, Um, and then all of the things that Theodore Roosevelt, when he was president, helped to get established, um, that they were all the result of people actively campaigning a president or an administration or Congress to say these resources, historic, cultural, natural, scenic, and recreational, they're important, they're universally significant, and we need to take some time to protect them. Maybe just another quick few seconds on that. I think one of the issues that relates to preservation from a racial perspective is that I think African Americans in particular, but black and brown people generally, we've been a little bit behind on the preservation issue, um, because we've had some other things to contend with. And as we move into the 21st century, I think now again is the time to begin looking to stories like Emmett Till and Mamie Till-Mobley, Medgar and Murray Evers, Birmingham Civil Rights, the Selma to Montgomery Trail, and seeing what we can do to make sure that these stories, our stories, American history, that just happens to involve us to a great extent, that these things are being captured and protected and preserved at the highest level. And you need a campaign to get that done. And right now, the highest level for me, I think, is the National Park Service. That is at the very top. If there's a league of preservation, and it doesn't exclude or preclude people who want to do things at the local level, at the state level, or have things that are privately owned. But the National Park System is, it's been with us for more than 100 years now. The Park Service was established in 1916. So it's been around for a while, and it is a system that has a lot of jewels in it. And there are about 40 sites that are African American experience sites in the current national park system. And NPCA is committed to making sure that we protect and preserve those sites right along with the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, Yosemite, the Everglades, and Shenandoah.
So, what listening to you talk about the process that way, it just struck me there are a lot of conversations that go on. So, this process, it sounds like it can take years to accomplish.
Well, you're right. So, two quick stories on that or anecdotes on that. I worked in coalition with a lot of other people for 10 years to get a special resource study bill passed for a Harriet Tubman site. Um, so that the special resource study, and we can get more into the details about how this process works, is the bill that authorizes the Secretary of the Interior to consider what ought to be included in a site if they decide that they want to move forward with one of those things. The designation of a park site, that took 10 years. The As you read out in the not so brief bio that I sent you, that President Biden did designate the Emmett Till and Mamie Till-Mobley National Monument in July of 2023. That's a campaign that I joined in 2018. So I was with it for 5 years, to say nothing of the people um, in Illinois, in Chicago, and in the Mississippi Delta who have been working to get this kind of positive change and affirmation of their history since the 1990s. So it can
Mm.
take a while. It can take a while.
So
Um,
one of the things that I've learned about is since working here is that it always takes longer for African American stuff to happen than it does for other cultures, or it seems to take longer. Why is that?
I know where you're headed with that, and I know how you feel about that. I'm not entirely sure that that's an accurate read on it.
And I'm
There have
glad you said it that way. Please clear it up, because I know, and I said it that way because I wanted you to clear, because I know other people may feel the same way as I do. So if I'm wrong, you'll be clearing it up for a lot of people.
Yeah, Antonia, I wanna respect and recognize what you just said, because I know it's based on heart, it's based on emotions, it's a little bit based on some facts. But what we have seen recently is that the National Park Service and the Department of the Interior and various administrations have taken a really dedicated effort in terms of trying to protect more of these resources. Um, and people have been working on, trying to get things like Belmont Paul women's equality. Now, there are black suffragists who are involved in that history as well. That took a long time. And there was a moment or two when Belmont Paul was, I think, an affiliated site before it got brought into the national park system as being a national monument designated by President Obama. So sometimes it takes time, it takes resources, it does take a campaign. Uh, Where I would sort of want to redirect some of that energy in terms of concerns about does it take longer to get an African American site um, added to the national park system or taken seriously for conservation or preservation is with this observation from me. The National Park Service has a reputation, and even right now, among maybe some of the people, many of the people perhaps who are tuning in to listen to this conversation, that when you say to them national parks, they think about capital N, capital P, places like the Grand Canyon and Yellowstone. They don't think about the Frederick Douglass Home necessarily. They don't think about Belmont Paul Women's Equality. They don't think about civil rights sites. And even some of the people who were involved in the Till-Mobley campaign when we first got started with them, and it became clear that the President of the United States wanted to use his executive authority to establish a national monument, there are some very, very smart people in Mississippi who said, "You want to build an obelisk like you've got in Washington?" It's like, no, no, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about something that is a national monument that is just one of
Mm,
the ways in which the Park Service designates its park sites and its preservation opportunities and projects. But we're talking about something that would incorporate or include the Tallahatchie County Courthouse and Grable Landing and maybe some other resources down there that were directly related to Emmett Till. So I think we are still to this day, as deep as we are in the 21st century, working with people and even some folks maybe within our own organization who tend to think, and certainly in Congress, who tend to think that a national park is something that is a large natural landscape and not something that has to do with history and culture. And so it can sometimes be more difficult, more challenging, though not impossible, to protect the smaller historic and cultural sites, irrespective of what they're talking about and what they're protecting and preserving. Now, having said that, let me go to the other side of my face and talk out of the other side of my mouth, because there are challenges sometimes to protecting certain stories related to the African American experience, and sometimes but that again goes back to the need for a campaign. It goes back to the need to begin, as we always begin at the National Parks Conservation Association, in hearing from people in communities. Again, these are smart, hardworking people who have carried their preservation efforts as far forward as they can. They're on, and I apologize for anyone who is not a football fan, but they've made it to the 20-yard line. And they are looking for help from a professional organization that can help to get them across the goal line and help them to achieve their preservation needs and preservation miracles. And so that's where we come in. And it sometimes takes time. So, what you're talking about, that feeling that it takes longer for African American sites or black and brown sites, that's a yes, but, and there's a couple of asterisks associated with that because what I've learned from my experience is that it takes a lot of time if you're going to do a campaign right, and if you're going to make sure that it has the funding and the political support that it needs, you got to take some time. And in fact, what I would share with you both and anybody who's interested is that if you told me that we could start a new national park campaign next week being, what is it, like the 24th, 25th of February, and that by the end of March of this year, we'd have a new national park, I wouldn't join your effort because there's something wrong. That's the Polaroid
wow.
instamatic way of getting stuff done, and I don't think that you would have been able, or we would have been able, to generate the political support, the financial support, the community-based support that we would need to make sure that that designation, once it got stood up, stayed up.
So basically, in a nutshell, you're saying the two most important skills to have are patience and people skills.
Patience and people skills, they're really critically important. Innovation is also a critical one. Um, yeah, but I think patience and people skills and learning to, again, where I just want to go back and make sure I'm a historian by training, go Howard University, go Bison. Um, But I got to tell you that in every campaign I've ever been involved with, I am always working with people who are a lot smarter than I am about the stories that we're protecting and preserving. They lived it in many instances, or they're family members with the people who were the principals in these stories. So I can read about it and I can go down there and kind of sense what it's like to be in the Mississippi Delta. But there were other people that we were working with who had lived it. Um,
Right.
And so I'd never take the approach, and none of my colleagues at NPCA, we never take the approach of going down there and saying, we're from NPCA, we're going to take over everything right now. You guys can sit back. We got it. We are here. to work with you, to struggle with you, to commiserate with you, to plan with you, to figure out how we can take your story and your resources that we think are important, otherwise we wouldn't be here, and move it forward and get that preservation win that's going to benefit you, but the entire country and the world. So, yeah, I think that was close to an answer.
Yep,
That
well,
was an answer. That was a
it
great
was.
answer. That was a great answer. That was a great answer.
What specifically drew you to the Emmett Till project and the Mamie?
So I didn't know a lot about Emmett Till. I had read a little bit about Emmett Till, and then, like a lot of African American people, it's just sort of like it's the story of a lynching of a 14-year-old kid. There is no happy ending, um, and so just kind of put that away. And then in 2018, we had just come off getting the Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument designated by President Obama, and that was a really successful campaign, largely run by my friend Brent Leggs at the Trust for Historic Preservation. And I came in, played a very capable second fiddle, and led NPCA's efforts at organizing on that. So it's a good team win and a great win for the city of Alabama and for the National Park Service and anybody interested in protecting and preserving civil rights heritage and history. I got to meet a woman by the name of Nikki Buffa, and Nikki's currently on our board for the National Parks Conservation Association. And she began working with some folks, my friends Patrick Weems, Elliot Long, and Benjamin Salisbury down in Sumner, Mississippi. They were pushing along this effort to establish an Emmett Till National Park, National Monument. And Nikki asked if I'd go down and meet with Patrick. So I got a ticket, flew down to Memphis, got a rental car, drove down to Sumner and saw the sites and began to meet with people. And what I recognized instantly is that the quality of the people who were engaged in this made me believe in the quality of the story and the need to get this done. And I think the interesting thing about the Till experience is that the more that I learned about that history, the more integral I came to understand it was to the modern civil rights movement. I'm not sure if you all are familiar, but so the quick timeline is that Emmett Till is a young African American kid in Chicago, summer of 1955. He begs and pleads with his mom because his 15-year-old cousin Wheeler Parker is going to take a train trip down to Money, Mississippi, and hang out with relatives. And Emmett wants to go, so he begs and pleads with his mom, and she finally says, "Okay, do it, but you need to be careful because you cannot act in Mississippi in 1955 the same way you were acting in Chicago in 1955. That's not going to work out." Emmett goes down. He hangs out with his relatives. The interesting thing is that all the people in that family in Money, Mississippi, and Till's family were working. They were in the fields picking cotton. And Emmett didn't like that. That wasn't a vacation that he wanted. So he went into the house and kind of hung out with the women who were making the food. On a Wednesday, I think it was the 24th of August, 1955, they went to Money to a place called Bryant's Grocery Store. And Emmett Till had an unfortunate interaction with a woman named Carolyn Bryant. And he did wolf whistle at her. Um, his friends got him in a car. They drove him back to his uncle Mosright's home. They didn't hear about anything for a couple of days. But then on Sunday, the 28th of August, early in the morning, two white men show up. One of them has a gun. The other has a flashlight. They kidnap Emmett Till at gunpoint. And that's the last that anybody ever saw him alive, was on Sunday morning, August 28th. His body is recovered from the Tallahatchie River a few days later. It is swollen and bruised and beaten. And it's clear that he has been shot in the head and murdered. And his mother, Mamie Till-Mobley, demands that his body be sent back to Chicago for an open casket funeral. And there are historic photographs of that. Hundreds of thousands of people viewed that body, shocked the world. And there's a trial in Tallahatchie County Courthouse in Sumner, Mississippi, a few weeks after the funeral, and Emmett Till's killers are found not guilty. An all white, all male jury takes about 75 minutes to find them not guilty. And I'll stop here and make the critical point. It was an all white, all male jury because jurors were selected from the voter registration rolls, and there were no African Americans who were registered to vote in Tallahatchie County. So whenever we have this conversation about voting and registering to vote, does it matter? Yes, it matters. Um, when these guys were acquitted, there's a sort of double jeopardy clause in the U.S. Constitution, and you can't be retried for the same offense if you have been cleared by a jury. So these guys come back in October and they do an interview in which they are paid, in which they admit to murdering Emmett Till in defense of white Southern womanhood. So they have just admitted that they've done the crime, but they're not going to be charged again for the same offense. In November of 1955, a gentleman by the name of Dr. T.R.M. Howard from Mound Bayou, Mississippi. And if y'all don't know about Mound Bayou, you need to visit, you need to learn. But Mound Bayou is an independent black township. Dr. T.R.M. Howard is going on a engagement speaking tours around southern places, African American audiences, talking about the egregious miscarriage of justice that's happened with Emmett Till. He winds up right around Thanksgiving 1955 at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery. It's King's, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it's his church. And he tells the audience the story of Emmett Till and what happened to that 14-year-old kid, about his killers being acquitted, and about the struggle now of a grieving mother to get justice for her son. And he asks a question that so many African Americans across the country had been asking in 1955. How long is this going to go on, and what are we going to do to stop it? So who's in the audience that night at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church? Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks has been a lifelong member of the NAACP, an advocate, an activist, and someone who had been working on establishing a bus boycott against the segregated buses in the city of Montgomery. And what does she do about 3 days later after Dr. T.R.M. Howard gives his address at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, December 1st, 1955? She refuses to give up her seat on that bus. She is thinking about years of oppression at the hands of Montgomery's white bus drivers, who especially took out their wrath and their racism on African American women. But she's pissed about Emmett Till. And she is motivated to take that action, to not give up that seat because of the injustice that occurred to that boy and what his mother must be going through as a grieving mom. The launch of the modern civil rights movement by most historians is linked to the Montgomery bus boycott that starts on December 1st, 1955. And that bus boycott could have happened at any time. But the woman who was the principal catalyst for that was thinking about what had happened to Emmett Till a few months before. About 100 years ago, you asked me the question of how I got interested in Emmett Till. It's learning about those connections and those pieces and how they support the overarching African American experience in this country, because it leads to the start of the Montgomery bus boycott. It launches the career of an up until then unknown black pastor by the name of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., begins his civil rights career, launches him on the road to winning the Nobel Peace Prize and Birmingham civil rights and other things like that, ultimately the assassination in 1968. But the murder of that young boy was really a catalyst for modern American history. And what we want to do, and what we have done successfully at NPCA, is to try to take stories like that, that have that heft and that gravity, and get them into the national park system, where they will be told by a federal agency that has a breadth and depth of experience telling these kinds of tragic stories. Not all our history has to be merry, but it does have to be well told, well interpreted, and presented to the public in a way that's accurate, honest, and inspiring. So that's the long form version, but that's how I got into this, because the history is so compelling and the story is so fundamentally acute to developing a better understanding of who we are as people.
That's amazing. Um, and I do love how you talked about Rosa Parks and connecting the two together, because there's so much, not just with Rosa, but there were a lot of young women back then that were sitting on those buses and was doing that exact same thing. Because, hats off to Miss Claudette Colvin, who was also doing the same thing. She was a young 15-year-old pregnant woman who did the exact same thing, who was sitting on that bus before Rosa, and she sat there and they didn't want her. She didn't want to get up because she was tired and she was pregnant, and she was also a part of getting that done, and they decided not to use her because she was a little bit too dark. It's just it's a lot of different people that led towards those types of things happening, and how this was going on, and I'm just so glad that you brought that up, and as far as that is concerned. But let me ask you this question: is there any federal funding that goes towards these type of monuments getting created.
Oh yeah, which is why anybody who's ever become a member of the National Parks Conservation Association, and if you're not, this is an unpaid solicitation for NPCA. Join up because we need you now more than ever. Um, so in their first 2 years of existence, if I'm not mistaken, a new national monument or even a new national park will get kind of like a smaller budget, kind of like a feeder budget to support operations. But then after that period, they get a line item in the federal budget. So at this point in time, Till-Mobley heading into 2025 should be kind of like an independent thing with a line item for its budget. And certainly Medgar and Murray Evers, their home in Jackson, Mississippi, Gettysburg National Military Park, the Grand Canyon, these all have budgets. Um, what we are doing right now at the National Parks Conservation Association is to try to make sure that the funding for these places for the entire national park system isn't cut in a draconian and punitive manner, because that's always going to impact some of the smaller and historic and cultural sites like Till-Mobley a little bit worse than it might a place like the Grand Canyon or Yellowstone. So yeah, they've got money, they're funded. And let me also just say on this point, that although national monuments are established by the president's use of the Antiquities Act as opposed to congressional designation and then having something signed into law, a national monument, a national historic site, a national park, a national historic trail, a national battlefield, a national shrine, all these, they're just different names for preservation efforts managed by the National Park Service up to the standards of the Secretary of the Interior. So we ain't fooling around.
Yes.
So my question leads on from Danya's. We're living in interesting and challenging times,
That part.
and yes, I think that's about as nicely as I can put that. So the majority of our audience would actually see the value and see the need of having an Emmett Till memorial, and including Mamie as well. What would you say to someone who drops on our YouTube, leaves a rude comment about wasting taxpayers' money? What does the country get from monuments like this?
Well, gosh, there's a couple of different ways we can go with this, and because I'm representing the National Parks Conservation Association, I got to go with the PG-13 way. We made a commitment more than 100 years ago that we were going to protect some of the most significant natural, cultural, scenic, recreational, and historic places on the American landscape, and we were going to do it by creating a national park system. It is my opinion that that park system is more relevant, more accessible, and more meaningful to all of us when it has the broad swath of our shared national narrative represented in the sites that are maintained by that national park system and by the National Park Service. And I think we need to understand that the history in this country, it's not all going to be about someone discovering something fantastic and then putting a patent on it and changing for the better the way people live. Abraham Lincoln talked about seeking to have a country, seeking to have a population that always tried to live up to the better angels of its nature. And we don't always get there. But I think the idea, again, going back to Lincoln, which is to move towards this more perfect union, we need to be able to understand what happened at places like Sand Creek Massacre, what happened at places like the Emmett Till and Mamie Till-Mobley National Monument, what happened with the suffragist movement and the 19th Amendment fight at Belmont Paul Women's Equality, and sites all up and down the landscape so that we have a better understanding of where we've come from and we're not doomed to repeat our history because we don't know it.
Mm.
So that would be my response. And I think that for the folks that are looking to cut budgets because it doesn't make sense, your taxes, you don't want your tax dollars going towards historic preservation or other things like that. Okay. I don't really have an answer for you except to say that part of living in a glorious country, in a country that is striving to become that more perfect union, is we've got to be there with science. We've got to be there with art. We've got to be there with industry. We've got to be there with historic and cultural resource preservation. All those things are important. All those are part of the ecosystem of this country and of our people. And you start pulling out one thing, pulling out the other thing, all the rest of it suffers too.
Well, it's a question I'm not asking you. I always ask myself, our founding fathers, the forefathers and mothers, they were a fractious bunch. they didn't even really, most of them didn't even really get along with each other any better then than we do now. I just wonder why we're struggling now more than then. Or maybe they were just really better at hiding it.
Well, yeah, imagine what it would have been like. We know that George Washington owned slaves, so he gets a couple of marks on his historic record because of that. But, the dude held together the Continental Army long enough to get the British to leave. And then, maybe more important, he had 2 terms as president. And when he got to the end of his second term, all he had to do was send out a letter to a couple of his friends in the military, and they would have put military forces in on the American East Coast that would have put him as president for life, king. And he didn't do that. He stepped away. Um, but even this guy, a personality so large as Washington, when he was first elected president, there were newspapers in this country, excuse me, who referred to him as King George IV.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, and if you think about, and one of the interesting things, and I'm learning more because I've been listening to a lot of on YouTube. There's a gentleman by the name of David Blight. He's a scholar at Yale, and he's written a number of books on Reconstruction. I think he just maybe a couple of years ago he put out a book on Frederick Douglass, and he has these lectures, and they're fascinating. But if you really want to get a sense of how people were banging heads, you need to investigate that relationship between Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, because they didn't start off as friends.
No, they did not.
They did
No,
not
they
start off as friends. And so I think that I am a fan of nuance. I am a fan of inconsistency because I think that's just the way that most of us are born, and the way that most of us move through life. And I am also a fan of what I think the National Park Service helps to do and what shows like this help to do as well. So thank you both again for making room for me and having this conversation. And that is, friends, it is time, long past time, that we elevate our understanding of history back up to the graduate level. We need to be at the AP level for American history and understanding American history, American politics, all the rest of this stuff. Because we see where being at the lower levels have been. At NPCA, we talk about campaigns. We talk about reaching out and being an advocate and defending national parks, and the African American experience is protected in the national park system. Write your legislator, write your congressperson. There's a lot of people out there who have no idea who they voted for or who their elected representatives are, but they can tell you who the mass singer is, and we need to work on that.
Mhm.
Alan, can you tell us the name of the guy that you just said again? One person just asked
Oh,
that.
Dr. David Blight, and the last name is Blight, David Blight, and I think he's
Okay.
a professor at Yale University. His lectures are all over YouTube, and it's just an easy way to kind of log on and spend an hour while you're, you know, pressing clothes or doing other things like that. And he's a brilliant guy, and I do like his perspective that he brings, and he also talks about the need to be. He talked about talking about somebody like Abraham Lincoln or even George Washington. These were inconsistent people. Um, and I think Frederick Douglass may have had a quote about Abraham Lincoln, or no, it was W.E.B. Du Bois who was writing about him decades after he had been assassinated, when he talked about, here was a guy who didn't much care for African Americans, but he
That's
freed some
right.
of them. Here is
Mm-hmm.
a man who had some challenges about, equal rights, but he armed black men and set them to fight for the Union. Those
Mm-hmm.
are the kinds of inconsistencies that make out real characters and make out real history. And so we've got to be able to acknowledge and absorb all those things when we're talking about some of these figures who make up part of this American experience, our shared national narrative.
Mhm. So one thing that I'm really intrigued about the Till family and the Till monument, but specifically what happened to Emmett in the kickstarting of the civil rights movement.
Mhm.
So I'm thinking about relatively recent modern history where we had the likes of Michael Brown, then we had Trayvon Martin, the whole world was on lockdown for COVID. We had Ahmaud Arbery, then we had George Floyd, then we had Breonna Taylor, and then the whole world could see this really kind of evil underbelly of this country. And but the sharing of the recent past was immediate because of social media, mobile phones, and just our ability to be able to use those platforms to get the word out and to share those videos. They didn't have that in the 1950s. They didn't have that with Emmett Till. Yet word about him just spread like wildfire. So, kind of what was our version of social media back in the 1950s?
Pullman porters,
Yep.
bringing down, copies of the Chicago Defender at risk to their
Yep.
employment or their lives, and dropping those off in communities throughout the South wherever they were making stops. We had talked about the role of African American women in the civil rights movement. And I mean, there's too many. We don't know enough about them, but Joanne Gibson Robinson was a professor at a university in Alabama. And the way that the Montgomery bus boycott got started was that she and some other faculty members hand cranked flyers saying, "Stay off the buses." And it was the Montgomery Women's Improvement League or Association, I've lost track of the exact title, that had been working on these issues. So it was a way to get information when you didn't have cell phones. And the other thing is, in Alabama and in Mississippi, when we look back at this through the kind of the haze or the fog of 2025, right, we tend to think of black people as being completely disfranchised or disenfranchised and having no power. But you had men and women who owned businesses. You had men and women who were on faculty at various universities or in various places. And you had people who were prepared to get the word out. You had young folks who, in Alabama, if you go to Birmingham, you can see the A.G. Gaston Motel, which the Park Service is in the middle of refurbishing at this point in time. And Dr. King set up his war room in the A.G. Gaston Motel. I think it was bombed twice in April of 1963 during the Project C protest. There were high school students and elementary school students who tried to sneak in so that they could hear what was going on, so that they could go back and tell their friends. And when they started to run out of adults in the Project C protest who would get themselves arrested trying to challenge segregation in Birmingham, the most segregated city in the United States, they had the Children's Crusade. And why? Because the kids were informed about the need and about the role that they could play. So we
Mm.
were able to get information out even without cell phones, without LinkedIn, without YouTube or TikTok or any of the other stuff that's out there, because it was just that critical. Now, on the other side of that, I have found people when I was working in Mississippi who never heard about Emmett Till when they were growing up as young African American kids, because again, it was not necessarily a story of empowerment. It wasn't something that you wanted to tell your children necessarily, because all it would do maybe is to instill fear. But I think people knew. They saw the photographs on, I think it was Jet magazine. They saw the photographs in the newspaper. They knew what had happened to that boy, and they knew that there was no reason for it. And then they were able to kind of connect that to what happened to Emmett Till is fundamentally related to the fact that I can't get a seat in a restaurant. I got to take my food out back, or that I can't get a seat on a bus. Um, and so when you start to put these things together, then it makes sense. And then they did what people have always done when they were organizing. You start where you're at with what you've got, and you do what you can where you're at.
But it's also, I mean, we have to also be honest. It they also didn't tell it because they were afraid. And at some point there were some that just did not tell that story because they didn't want them to know. And it's a part of a story that we still deal with today. And then the other thing is so funny because when I was writing my book, when you talked about the Chicago Defender, that was one of the histories that I learned, how the Pullman guys were literally the people. The paper was the way that our stories came out. They were literally Facebook today and TikTok today. That was how our stories were told because that's how they got that information out there. That's what we did. And with everything that's going on today, people need to realize that Facebook and TikTok that wasn't there back then. We have to get these things out, word of mouth. We have to get these things out. We have to tell everybody what's going on, how we're going to do it. This is the way to move. This is how we have to get these things done. And I mean, when I look at history and how things were done back then I am in such an awe. I'm so awe-inspired by it because I have an uncle who was a part of the National Negro Congress at Howard University when it was started in 1940, and the things that they did and the moves that they made, and it's just amazing to me the things that happened and how they carried things out. I don't know, but I don't know. I wanted to ask another question though, as far as Mamie Till and them. It's three different monuments. It's the or is it three different monuments? You have the courthouse, you have the church itself, and then is it the statues or is it the river? Like how is this working?
So there's one site. It's the Emmett Till and Mamie Till-Mobley National Monument, but there are three non-contiguous components. In
Okay.
Chicago, you've got Robert's Temple Church of God in Christ. The Kojic folks were incredibly important in the civil rights movement. And Robert's Temple Church of God in Christ on Chicago's south side at 40th and State Streets, you can see downtown Chicago from there, was where Mamie Till-Mobley had the open casket funeral September 3rd, 1955, I think it was. So
Okay.
that is part of the territory. They have the church is still a private church. It's a functioning church, but the Park Service has an easement on some of the territory there, and so that is one component of the monument. The second component is the Tallahatchie County Courthouse in Sumner, Mississippi, and that is where the trial took place. And the interior of that courthouse has been refurbished to its 1955 historic appearance. So you can go in there and kind of see what it would have been like to be in there in August of 1955, and the tight circumstances and the segregated accommodations for Mamie Till-Mobley and members of the African American press. And I think Congressman Charles Diggs had come down from Illinois to see the trial. And then the third part is near a place called Glendora, Mississippi. It's the body recovery site on the Tallahatchie River, and it's a place called Grable Landing. So Grable Landing, the Tallahatchie County Courthouse, and Robert's Temple Church of God in Christ in Chicago are the three non-contiguous or discontiguous components of the one Emmett Till and Mamie Till-Mobley National Monument.
Okay.
I guess my last observation, you said something that really sparked something in me about people not wanting to talk to their children specifically about the Emmett Till story because of knowing wanting to raise their children in fear. I'm going to kind of say we already do, whether we realize it or not. The fact that grandparents, parents, aunties, and uncles have to have the talk specifically about how to engage with the police if you get pulled over in your car. That is that's fear-based education. Whether we realize it or not, and again, I'm thinking even my own childhood. I was taught the dangers of having to navigate a world that really didn't want me in it, but a world that I was surrounded by, and I knew that if I want to attain my professional dreams, I had to navigate.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yep.
I didn't have the freeing kind of childhood that people who are not us got to enjoy. And I think that that's a pretty common experience amongst many Black households.
Yeah, because I had to talk with my kids.
So I think
Well,
trying not to tell the stories, might as well tell the stories.
well, I think because it's our history, it's our story, and I had said earlier when we were talking that there's no happy ending, and a happy ending is the wrong way to talk about that. But we have. Let me say this, and then if people want to disagree, please feel free to disagree. But Emmett Till was the victim of a lynching. His mother, Mamie Till-Mobley, was the hero in this story because she
Yes, she
devoted the rest
was.
of her life to
Mhm.
trying to ensure that what had happened to her child never happened to anybody else's child ever again, regardless of color, race, ethnicity, anything like that. And she spent a lifetime doing that work. Um, and so but we talk about having that conversation before Emmett got on that train to go down to Mississippi. She pleaded with him, if anything happens down there, and I think I'm paraphrasing poorly, but her remarks were something to the effect of just go low,
Hmm.
apologize, do whatever you need to do to get out of the circumstances. And of course, that went in one ear and out the other because Emmett Till was 14 years old in 1955. He was a precocious young kid. He was a prankster. He was a jokester. And he was someone who, like a lot of 14-year-old kids do, was trying to sort of show that he had a little bit of game. And that was the thing that got him in trouble and got him killed in Mississippi. Or maybe the better way to put that is it was the racist and white supremacist social mores and the way they responded to somebody like Emmett Till that got him in trouble and got him killed. But that talk that you're talking about, Brian, and that you're talking about, Danya, is the same one that Mamie Till-Mobley had with her son before she put him on that train.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
it just did not work. And, we got a little bit of time left, so let me tell this. And again, some of these stories are tough to hear, they're tough to know. But there was a sheriff's deputy once Emmett Till's body was recovered from the Tallahatchie River. And I think it was a deputy from Sunflower County, and one of the reporters who was covering the disappearance of the kid and then subsequently the murder asked the deputy, "Are you surprised that his body was fetched out of the Tallahatchie River?" And the deputy turned to the reporter, and I think both these people were white. And he said, "No, I'm not surprised. That river is full of niggers."
Yes.
Hmm.
That's what was happening in that part of Mississippi and other parts of the
Yes.
South in that period. And so it wasn't, you're right that there was fear, Danya, but it wasn't just that, somebody's going to come and do to you, my children, what they do to Emmett Till. It was, they were going to do what they did to Reverend George Lee.
Mm-hmm.
Reverend Lee, in I think it was May of 1955, was standing on the courthouse steps in Brookhaven, Mississippi, trying to hand out voter registration um, pamphlets or whatever to African Americans, and he was shot on the steps of the courthouse in broad daylight at high noon.
Yep.
And they were never able to convene a grand jury because none of the witnesses came forward.
Nope.
So this sort of thing was happening over and over and over and over and over and over again. And so I think, if you talk about challenging stories, I'm not sure that I would want to tell my kids about that either. But then what did happen is that, you had people who were, like John Lewis or Fannie Lou Hamer or, Congressman Benny Thompson, who grew up as a foot soldier in the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement, who knew or had some understanding of what was going on, knew about the odds that were pressed against them, and still managed to take action and make a difference.
Yes.
I don't want to call that a happy ending, but that's some resilience for you right there.
Yes, it is. And I just want to address this one question that Miss McClendon had. I don't want. She said, "How do those who are related to the murderers fight the stigma and get people to understand that just because some relatives were mean and murderers doesn't mean that we share their racist, feelings?" And I don't think that we feel. For me, and you guys can answer on your own, and we got to be quick with it. For me personally, I just think you need to go ahead and you need to do. You fight your fight. You do what you need to do to move forward beyond how those people how they felt. That's my quick answer. You move forward beyond how they felt. And you don't have to be like them. That's all that I can say. That's my quick answer to that. I don't ever think. I mean, my direct ancestor was one of the most racist people in the world, Preston Brooks. He was the one of the most racist people in the world, and I'm not racist, but you just still got to move forward, and you got to do what you need to do as your own person, and don't claim their life. Don't claim what they did, but also don't. You just got to move forward. That's my answer.
I have a quick one. Raymond Byrd. I'm related to him. This is a gentleman who was lynched in Virginia in about 1921. His lynching was so bad that Virginia actually introduced the anti-lynching legislation a year later. There are people alive today who knew deeply a lot of that history, and I've had descendants of some of the people who were involved in the lynching party reach out to genuinely apologize. And I say, well, you should actually apologize more to his descendants. I'm just a cousin, but I'm sure have that conversation with his descendants, and I believe some of them actually have. Does that change anything? No. But it starts to break down that myth and feelings of antipathy and shame that people have.
Yeah, I might add for Miss McClendon that the Tallahatchie County issued an apology to the Till family in the 2000s, 2006, 2007, and basically saying we got it wrong. And there was one woman, the Till family had been asked to come down so that the apology could be read to them, and she said, this doesn't resolve everything, but maybe for the first time I feel like I can breathe.
Mhm.
And so that was helpful. The other thing that I would share is just a book recommendation, and that is there's a book by a guy by the name of Wright Thompson. I got to meet Wright when we were working on the Till campaign. He's from Mississippi. He's a white guy, and so it's Wright Thompson, Thompson, called The Barn, and it is a history of the barn in Drew, Mississippi, where Till was taken and then beaten and tortured and ultimately murdered. And one of the things that I admire about the way Wright Thompson has written this book, The Barn, is that he brings in, as a white person, his own history, his family's relationship to the land and how that land was taken from indigenous folks or those sorts of things. I'm getting the story a little bit muddled up here, but it is well worth the read. And I think that it's possible to apologize for past actions without apologizing for who you are, as
That's
long
right.
as you are making that break and identifying yourself as being someone who is now on what I would refer to as the right side of history. I'll tell you really quickly. When we were doing Birmingham civil rights, we had the Secretary of the Interior came down to the 16th Street Baptist Church where those four girls have been killed in that bombing in September 1963. And some of the worst images that you've seen from the civil rights movement are of the Birmingham Fire Department turning their hoses on nonviolent protesters. And I was outside the Birmingham 16th Street Baptist Church when a hook and ladder, bright and shiny hook and ladder from the Birmingham Fire Department showed up, parked along the side of the church where the bomb had actually gone off, and off of that fire truck came a rainbow coalition of Birmingham Fire Department members, men and women, black and brown and white people in their best uniforms. And they got off that truck and they went up the stairs to the church and they went inside for that. And it's something where I always still get choked up when I remember this because it was like they were saying the fire department in this town got it wrong in 1963. We're here with you now in 2016 to make sure you know we've got it right.
Amen. Well, this show went fast.
It did. It did. Thank you so much, Alan, for joining us today.
Yes,
It's
thank
been
you
my
so
pleasure.
much.
Thank you both.
Don't hang up. Don't hang up. We want to thank you guys again for joining us. Enjoy your rainy. I don't know. Sometimes it's raining, sometimes it's not. Enjoy your Sunday, and you guys have a great day. I'm Danya.
I'm Brian, and we will see you next week, 4 p.m. in all the usual standard places. Until then,
Yes.
have a great Sunday.
Bye, guys.
Bye bye.